to be here. As Leslie said, I'm a dendrochronologist, a tree ring scientist. So I figured I would start this talk by showing y'all what I am so excited about when it comes to tree rings and really what got me started in this field. So let me share my screen here for a second. I'm not going to start with the presentation yet. So this is a website developed by my colleague Dan Griffin at the University of Minnesota. And what you see here are scans of tree ring samples. So we sample tree rings mostly with a hollow core that does not harm the tree. With a core, you core into the tree, and this is what you get out of it. And so you can see all the tree rings from the pith of the tree, so the oldest part of the tree, to the bark, which is the most recent ring. And I'm going to click on one of these samples to give you an idea. This is a sample from a Doug fir, a young Doug fir. I think it's about 60 years old. And so you can clearly see the individual rings. What you can also see is that not every ring is equally wide. So there's variability in how wide these rings are. And this is a tree from New Mexico, which is a dry environment. And so the width of the ring tells us something about the climate in New Mexico in this case. So wide rings, the tree grows a lot and is happy in wet years, and it grows narrow rings, or it doesn't grow a lot when it doesn't have a lot of water in dry years. And so the reason I'm showing this this app or this website is that it allows you, these are really high resolution images of these tree ring cores, and it allows you to zoom in. And so when you zoom in, you start seeing what these tree rings actually consist of. So this is an individual ring. From a distance, it just looks like, you know, you just see the dark bands, but really what this consists of, an individual ring represents one growing season. The tree forms, so this is a conifer, Doug fir, it forms, I'll zoom in a little more. There we go. It forms relatively big cells with thin cell walls in the early spring. So in the spring, when the tree starts growing, it needs to be able to transport a lot of water from its roots to its leaves. So it needs bigger cells, and that's what this is. And this is early wood. Now, towards the end of the season, in late summer, that transport function is less important. And what is more important is that the tree adds on stability. So it's gonna form smaller cells, but with thicker cell walls. So the thick cell walls, the denser wood, create the stability that the tree needs. And then what you see here, I'll move this up a little bit. So then the tree stops growing, you know, at the end, in the fall, sometimes September, October. It doesn't grow at all in winter when the days are too short and too cold. And then it starts growing again the next spring. And the ring boundary that you see, the rings that you see is actually the transition between the late wood, the dense wood that the tree forms in the fall of one year, and the early wood, the bigger cells that the tree forms in the next years. Those are the tree ring boundaries. So as I mentioned, this is a conifer. The wood is pretty straightforward, right? You see one type of cell, the cell changes itself, but other than that, they're pretty straight lines of one type of cell. I'm gonna go out of here and now show you a different kind of tree. This is from Gamble oak. Also from the same region, but a deciduous tree, an oak tree. And when you zoom in now, so same idea, you get the ring widths, some are narrow, some are wide. But if you zoom in, you'll see that the actual anatomy of the wood is completely different. So now this is one ring here. And it no longer consists of one type of wood cell, but you get the vessels, the big cell types that are specialized for water transport, and they're big in the early wood. Same thing, trees need to be able to transport a lot of water in the spring, but then these vessels become fewer and smaller in the late wood. And so then the tree stops growing again, and then you get the big vessels in the early wood again. So it's the same idea of what one tree ring consists of, but the anatomy of the wood is completely different. You see very different cell types compared to conifers, and just a different way of looking at tree rings, or the different way that the tree rings are formed. So I'll let that be and stop sharing for a moment. So as Leslie mentioned, my background is in bioscience engineering, so in forest engineering. I got all of my education in Belgium, and I took a class in wood anatomy in college, and that's really, I really like looking at wood through a microscope. I really like the combination of how beautiful it is, yet how functional, and how much diversity there is between the different kinds of trees. So yeah, I don't have a background in climatology. It took me a long time to get my degrees in Belgium. It took me 5 years to get a bachelor's degree, another 2 to get a master's, another 5 to get a PhD. For various reasons, as it is with everyone. But back then, so we're talking about the 90s and early 2000s, I was already interested in climate when I was getting my degrees, but there was very little, there weren't any degrees in climatology, or even meteorology was really hard to find. So when I started college, I couldn't find a degree to get to go into climate science. So I decided on bioscience engineering, which is a very broad degree. And over my 12 years of studies, I've had one climate class, which was called eco-climatology, and which was all about carbon fluxes. So it actually had nothing, or not nothing, but very little to do with climate dynamics. And on a side note, I did not have a single female professor in those 12 years. Female professors in an engineering department were not a thing back then. So I had to kind of cobble my research interests and my role models together outside of, I guess, my formal training. And so after my PhD, I went to do a postdoc in the geography department at Penn State. And that's where I started working on wildfires, again, using tree rings. And that's when I first started looking into climate. So looking at the link between wildfires and climate, and I'll talk a bit about that later on in this talk. After 2 years in central Pennsylvania, I kind of had enough of central Pennsylvania, and I got a job offer in Switzerland at the WSL, which was a very good dendroclimatology group. And so at that point, my plan originally was, when I left Belgium, was just to go away for 2 years and then come back. But there wasn't, at that point, there wasn't really anyone doing dendroclimatology in Belgium. There was very few jobs in paleoclimatology. So I figured Switzerland was, you know, as close to Belgium as I was going to get. And also it's Switzerland. I mean, it's a nice place to live. So I went to do a second postdoc in Jan Esper's group, and that's where I really, my research focus really honed in on paleoclimate research, and I learned a lot in that group. And from there, then a position opened up at the University of Arizona. Sorry, I'm telling a long story here. A permanent position, a professor position at the University of Arizona, in a tree-ring lab that I applied and got. This is now 10 years ago. And so this is where I guess the second part of my talk starts. I guess I'm just saying that from an outsider my career might look pretty linear. I've really only ever done dendrochronology. I don't know how to do many other things. But as it was unfolding, my career did not look linear at all. A lot of the career decisions I made seemed haphazard and by chance, and it's only looking back that they appear to be linear. The other thing I want to say is that, yes, I came into climate science from an engineering background, and then I went into a geography department. I learned about wildfires, so it was also, thematically, it was not a linear research direction, but that background in engineering and in fire has really enriched, I think, the research that I do now. It allowed me to not look at climate and paleoclimate in this case from one angle, but really to make connections between the different fields that I've studied in my background, which is something I would encourage people, that you don't lose that background. It's not because you move on to a different topic that you no longer have that first topic in your head. So with all that talking, I'll start actually presenting some of the research that I've been talking about. As I mentioned, I'm a professor in the Laboratory of Tree-Ring Research at the University of Arizona, which is a department in and of its own. So there's about 12 professors who all study, whose research all focuses on tree-ring research or dendrochronology. Some of us are climatologists, some of us are ecologists, some of us are archaeologists. So all of these applications are united in one department. In my research group, we focus, really our research focus is climate change of the past and how it has influenced human societies on the one hand, forest ecosystems on the other hand, and then the carbon cycle and specifically forest disturbances such as wildfire. So how all of these factors of the Earth system interact with each other on near paleoclimate timescales. As Leslie mentioned, I wrote a book. I was on a sabbatical a couple of years ago, decided to write a broad audience book, not just about my research, but about dendrochronology, the field as a whole. It's called Tree Story, the History of the World, Written in Rings. It's been translated in Spanish recently, and also in Dutch a year ago, and there's more languages forthcoming. Italian, Chinese, and Turkish, amongst others. But so if you want to learn more about dendrochronology, I can recommend my own book. That's a weird thing to do, I guess, but here we are. So today I obviously want to focus on the climate and dendroclimatology. And when it comes to tree rings as a paleoclimate proxy, we focus primarily on the past more or less 2,000 years. So we're limited with tree rings. It's difficult to go further back in time. We're limited by the availability of wood and the age of trees. But on the other hand, we have the advantage, as I showed in that website application in the beginning, that we have a tree ring each and every year. And so that means that we can actually calibrate our annual resolution tree ring data against climate data, against instrumental climate data. We don't have to guess what our tree rings represent. We can actually statistically test what our tree rings represent. And that's a very powerful tool. In addition to that, compared to some other timescales, 2,000 years is not that long. But they are relevant because it's the best documented time period in human history. So we can actually compare our reconstructions, our climate reconstructions, to events that have been documented in human history. And then these are also the decadal to centennial timescales are also quite policy relevant. These are timescales that, you know, when we look at projections of the future, we're talking about 2100, you know, those are decades away. These are timescales that we can actually influence with what we do as a society. This map, so the dendrochronology community, I'm very fortunate to be part of it. We are quite a social and collaborative community. So we have already since the 1980s, a database that includes where researchers contribute the Tree-Ring chronologies that they have developed. It's the International Tree-Ring Databank hosted by NOAA. At this point, there's more than 4,000 site chronologies in that databank that are publicly available. As you can see on this map, they are primarily focused in the Northern Hemisphere. There's fewer landmass in the Southern Hemisphere, and then the tropical regions are difficult for tree rings. They're not impossible, but it's much more complex to develop tree-ring chronologies in tropical regions. I won't go into detail about that here. But so in my research group, we're really interested in, we're focusing on reconstructing the climate, not in one point in space, but to make use of this existing network and to add on to it, to look at climate dynamics, at how the climate in different areas is linked to each other over time on decadal to centennial timescale. So to use this network to look at natural climate dynamical variability, primarily in the Northern Hemisphere, as I mentioned. So in terms of this goes back to what we do in my lab. Today I'll focus on the atmospheric circulation patterns side of our climate change research. And the mission of my lab, we want to put it in one sentence, is to optimize our expertise in tree-ring research to address some of the most pressing climate change issues. So not to start with the tree rings and see, here we have these tree-ring records that we collected. What did they tell us? What can we say based on these tree-ring records? But to really go the other way around and go like, what are some big unanswered climate change questions that we can help answering with our tree rings, and what tree rings do we need to answer those questions? And so today I'll give 3 examples, 2 really. So I'll talk about jet stream variability. I'll talk about fire history in California. And then the third topic will be linking California fire history to jet stream variability. I know fire history is one step removed from climate, but they're importantly linked. So our research on jet stream variability, I can't help myself but show some photos of beautiful sites and trees to make all of you climate modelers who never go into the field jealous of this exciting aspect of being a tree-ring researcher. It started when I went to Bulgaria in the late 2000s and went to this site in the Pyrenean Mountains where there's beautiful old trees. Here are some examples of my colleague Franz Herzig coring a beautiful oak Bosnian pine, old Bosnian pine, in very steep mountain environment. And so what we did with these trees, some of them were up to 800 years old, is we measured a ring width, but the ring width wasn't all that strongly linked to climate because, this is a very dry environment, so the trees respond to how wet or dry it is. But it's also very high elevation, so they also respond to how cold or hot it is. So their ring width is really a mixture of drought and temperature, which is not ideal for climate reconstruction. Now, if you remember when the website I showed, if you know that the density of the wood varies within a ring, but also between rings. So you can measure not only the ring width, but also how dense the wood is in a certain year versus other years. And that density of the wood turns out is much more sensitive to temperature alone. It doesn't really depend a lot on drought or precipitation in these environments, but it really gives a much more clear image of temperature variability. And so when we published a temperature reconstruction based on the black square there is our site in Bulgaria, this is a correlation map between the tree ring record from that site and other tree ring records throughout Europe. With the warm colors, red and yellow and orange, meaning positive correlations. And this is kind of what we expected. You expect a tree ring chronology from the Balkans, from a certain pine species, to be positively correlated with other temperature reconstructions, other tree ring chronologies in its vicinity, and for that correlation to weaken as you are geographically more removed from the site. So these weak correlations in Central Europe, we expected as well. What I didn't expect, though, was to find these statistically significant negative correlations with temperature reconstructions in the British Isles and in Scandinavia and Northwestern Europe. So I saw this, I noticed it, wasn't really sure what was going on. But so appears to be an anti-correlation between temperatures in the Balkans and temperatures in the British Isles. This is for the summer season. We published this paper in 2012, and that same summer I went to visit my parents who still live in Belgium. And those of you who live in Belgium or in neighboring countries know that the summers in Belgium are rarely very exciting weather-wise, but 2012 was really bad. It just rained nonstop, or that's at least in my memory, that's how it was. It was cold and it rained continuously. And the weather was so bad that this is the weather map from one of the days that I was there in Belgium, from the newspaper. And the weather was so bad that even in the newspaper, they were writing about it. And so when I saw this weather map, this reminded me an awful lot of that map that I just showed you that I published, in that the weather in Belgium and the British Isles was really cold and wet. But at the same time, in the Balkans, there was a heat wave going on. And so you get this same anti-correlations in summer weather between the British Isles or Northwestern Europe and Southeastern Europe. And so this made me look into what is causing that anti-correlation, that temperature dipole. And it turns out it's the position of the jet stream. So in summer, the jet stream, in normal conditions on the left, the jet stream is located just on average, just north of the British Isles. And so you can think of, you're all climatologists, you know about the jet stream. These are the winds at high elevation, just under the tropopause, that blow in an eastward direction around, in this case, around the northern hemisphere. And so on average, these winds blow just north of the British Isles, and you can think of them in a very simplified manner as the boundary between the cool air from the Arctic that stays north of the jet stream position and the warm tropical air from the tropics that stays south of the jet stream. So you can think of the jet stream as the boundary between cool Arctic air and warm tropical air. And so that means when a jet stream is further north, is on average, that the warm tropical air reaches Western Europe and creates nice warm summer conditions in the British Isles and Belgium. 2012, however, the jet stream was further south than normal. It was abnormally southern and went straight over Belgium, creating all of that precipitation, whereas the cool air from the Arctic came much further south than normal, creating cool conditions in the British Isles and kind of condensing on the other end of the spectrum, condensing that warm tropical air over the Balkans. So that's And the opposite happens when a jet stream is abnormally northern. But so it's the position, the latitude of the jet stream that is creating that temperature dipole that we've been seeing in the tree rings and in instrumental temperature data. So our target of reconstruction, I should maybe mention that here, is the position of the jet stream. So the latitude of the jet stream just west of Europe. So over the very eastern North Atlantic, how the anomaly of the latitude of the jet stream in August versus its average position. If you take that target instrumental data and you correlate it against summer temperatures in Europe, you get this correlation map as what we expect, an anti-correlation, so a dipole between summer temperatures in the British Isles and in the Balkans. So our idea was, if we take tree rings from those two regions, and we know that those two regions are heavily impacted by the position of the jet stream, can we then use those tree rings that are temperature sensitive to reconstruct that position of the jet stream? And the reason why, the reason behind this, and I won't go into too much detail about this, but what is going to happen to the jet stream under future anthropogenic climate change is one of those big debated questions of climate science. So there is one train of thought that one side of the debate is talking about anthropogenic climate change and Arctic amplification that is related to it, creating a more wavy jet stream, so bigger waves in the jet stream as it moves around the Northern Hemisphere. We've been noticing these bigger waves. And these bigger waves create climate extremes, so that's why they're important. But not all data and not all model runs support this mechanism of anthropogenic climate change driving that waviness. And so the reason why, or not the reason why, one of the reasons why there is debate about this and uncertainty about the role of anthropogenic climate change and greenhouse gases in recent jet stream behavior is that we're working with very short time series, relatively speaking. So the best way to study the jet stream is using satellite imagery, so the last 40 years at best. But that's not a lot if you're looking at trends and if you're looking at the role of anthropogenic climate change, which really has been ongoing as well during those 40 years. So that's where we can hopefully come in with our tree rings and provide a longer record that is better to look at trends, but also that gives a record of natural variability in jet stream behavior. So not only jet stream behavior under anthropogenic climate change, but also pre-industrial times. As I mentioned, our plan was to use that tree-ring record that we developed for the Balkans, combine it with a tree-ring record from our colleagues from the British Isles, and see whether we can, one, reconstruct temperature in those regions, and two, whether we can reconstruct the jet stream doing that. And so just to step back for 1 second here, our plan was to, this is an image similar to what I showed at the beginning, is to, what we're doing when we measure density is measure really the way we measure, or the density is a function of the width of the cell walls specifically in the late wood cells. So what we're doing is measuring cell wall width in individual cells of individual rings, and then linking it to patterns that happen 10 kilometers above the Earth's surface at hemispheric scale. So it's quite ambitious to go from the cellular scale to the hemispheric scale. but I'll show you that it works. So these are the correlation maps on the left of the tree ring record from the British Isles. So you see strong correlations with temperatures over the British Isles, a slight anti-correlation with temperatures over the Balkans. On the right is a correlation between our tree ring record from the Balkans in this case with temperature. So you see positive correlation with temperature in the Balkans, anti-correlation with temperature over the British Isles, as you would expect. As a result, in red is the Balkans, blue is the British Isles, with the Balkans tree ring series inversed. The two tree ring series that go back to 1725, they counter-correlate with each other, which is what you would expect. So they represent the temperature dipole, not just over the instrumental period, but going back over the length of the tree ring record back to 1725. If you then combine those two tree ring records in blue and you compare them, so calibrate them against the instrumental record of the North Atlantic jet latitude. So the red line is the latitude of the North Atlantic jet in summer in August, its variability from year to year. In this case, we use the 20th century reanalysis data as a target. Our tree ring record, we had to rely heavily on tree ring records that were developed in the early 1980s. So the most recent tree ring, unfortunately, goes to 1978 only. But you see that over that period from 1920 to 1978, the tree rings actually reflect very well. The combination of the tree rings from the Balkans and the British Isles reflects variability in the North Atlantic jet quite well. This is then our reconstruction. So you can use that relationship between the North Atlantic jet latitude and the tree rings to reconstruct the jet latitude back in time. And when you do that reconstruction, you don't really see a trend in the average position, in the average latitude of the North Atlantic jet. So the 20th century North Atlantic jet seems within the realm of its history over the past 300 years. However, when you look at the variability, the variance of the year-to-year variance of the jet over the 20th century, that's the lower graph is a function of that. You can see that actually there's much more extremes in the position of the North Atlantic jet since about 1960 compared to the period before. So there is more variance, which is reflective of a wavier jet. So there are more northern and southern extremes in the position of the jet over the North Atlantic in summer. This graph, so our reconstruction, or sorry, the variance of the running variance of our reconstruction is at the very bottom. This graph shows, so we see this increase in variance since about 1960. This graph shows that we see that increased variability in the climate system, not only in our reconstruction from the North Atlantic, but also in other reconstructions that are not jet stream reconstructions, because ours was until then the first jet stream reconstruction, but climate dynamical indices related to the jet stream, such as El Nino system, such as storm tracks in the Pacific Northwest and in California. So you see this increase in variance since around the same time, since around 1960, in all of these jet stream related systems. And at the top is, in this case, not from proxies or not paleoclimate, but instrumental data and models. This is from Mike Mann's work. You can see an increase in jet stream quasi-resonance there as well. So this post-1960s increase that we see in North Atlantic jet anomalies is unprecedented over the past 300 years. We see it not just in the North Atlantic, but in other jet stream related proxies as well. And it is reflective of a wavier, slower jet stream. So our data do not say whether that is caused by Arctic amplification, anthropogenic greenhouse gas or not, but we do demonstrate that the jet stream is becoming more variable and that increase in variance is unprecedented over the past 300 years. Now, this paper was a springboard to some more jet stream related research we're doing now. As Leslie mentioned, we went back to the Balkans a number of times, including in Greece. We found Adonis, the oldest dendrochronologically dated living tree in Europe, also Bosnian pine. Adonis was 1,075 years when it was sampled 5 years ago. So I guess 5 years older now. It was not the only old tree on that site. So this is from Smolikas in Greece. You can see a lot of old trees, but also this old wood that's still lying on the landscape. So we're not limited to just using living trees for our research. We can also use trees that had died. Some of these trees died 500 or 1,000 years ago, but their wood is still there. So that allows us to go further back in time than with living trees alone. So we now have a much longer record from Greece. Our colleagues in Scotland have also been working hard to go back further back in time. So right now we're working on a North Atlantic jet reconstruction that does go back much further than to 1725. So we're aiming for the past 800 years. And we've changed our target of reconstruction a bit. So I won't go into too much detail, but we're looking, it turns out that if you take the field of jet latitude as we calculated before, but over Europe, so 30 west to 40 east, you do a PC analysis of that. It turns out that the PC2 actually really reflects the temperature dipole that I talked about before quite well, as you can see on the maps on the right. So those are, the top is a positive and the bottom is a negative PC2 values. And so those are the temperature anomalies related to those extremes of the PC2 of the jet. So now we're using those 800-year tree rings to reconstruct that new target of the PC2 of the jet. We're expanding this season from August alone to July and August. A lot of work put into this by my former postdoc, now Valerie Trouet. But this is preliminary work, but it already shows us that it will allow us to look this longer timescales to link it to human history as what I was talking about. So for instance, this most negative value of the reconstruction, 1782, already that most negative value reflects that temperature dipole that I was talking about. So we know from documentary data that in Scotland and the British Isles, this was an extremely cold summer. A grain harvest failed, famines galore in 1782, and it was part of what drove the emigration of a lot of people from Scotland to the United States. On the other end of the dipole, in 1782, very dry conditions, very hot conditions, and this is the year that the big fire in Constantinople in Istanbul happened. So that's a good historical equivalent or example of what such a dipole can cause. Another historical example to look into is a great famine in Western Europe, Northwestern Europe, 1315 to 1317, which we know was caused by very wet conditions, again, that created failed grain harvest. And as you can see in this preliminary graph, is that was a period of prolonged negative jet positions in summer. Another aspect that we're looking into is relating those jet anomalies using tree rings, but also using vegetation models to see how they influence tree growth and the carbon cycle. So this is now no longer on reconstruction timescales, but working on instrumental timescales. And so linking, we see that this variability in the position of the jet explains a lot of variance in the variability in tree growth, interannual variability in tree growth over the European continent. All right, I'll change gears here as we're talking about the influence of climate on wildfire. Another aspect I do want to talk about, but I'm going to check how I'm doing for time here. It's a little hard to check. Another aspect we can study with tree rings is wildfires in California. And when we talk about fires in California, there's a very clear trend that most of you must have heard in recent years in the news. It comes in the news quite often, that the annual area burned, so the amount of wildfire in California has increased dramatically, even just over the past 50 years. So fivefold, there's 5 times more forest burn now than 50 years ago. If you look at what's causing that, climate change definitely plays a role in it. Makes the forests drier and the summers hotter. But if you look at this is an attribution study. If you look at the wildfire trend over the past 40 years, in this case, this is now for the whole of the American West, not just California. A lot of it can be explained with climate change, but not all of it. So even without climate change, there would still be an increase in wildfire activity in the American West. And so the question is, what is causing that additional increase? Why is there more to the story than climate change alone? And that's where we come in with our tree rings. This is now a whole different way of using tree rings to study forests and history. So in this case, we're not looking at the width of the rings, but we're looking at the scars that are left by the fires in those trees. So we're talking about ground fires, not fires that don't destroy the trees, but that scar the trees, that leave scars in the trees. This is an example. So on the right is a stump in the Sierra Nevada. It has 2 sequences of fire scars, and each of these lines that you see is a scar created by a subsequent fire. So some of these trees have been burned by 20, 30 fires before they eventually were cut down. So these are fires that don't kill the trees, but they scar the trees. And so if you take a sample through here, you get this. And so you can clearly see each of those scars that was left by a subsequent fire. And then by tree ring dating, you can date the year in which each of these fires happened. So this is, again, an example. So you can see the tree rings, you can date what year each ring corresponds to, and then you can date what year each of these fire scars correspond to. Sometimes you can even date the fire scars to the season. So for instance, here you see this scar was left in the middle of the tree ring in the early wood still. So that means it was a spring fire rather than this fire, which happened in the late wood, which would have been a fall fire. So we don't do this research based on one tree. We do this kind of research based on many trees. And so for instance, this example, you can see, there was a fire that harmed this tree every 10 to 15 years on average between 1820 and 1896. Okay. We do this based on a lot of samples, and when we do that, we can put a chronology together for the entire Sierra Nevada. So this is a fire chronology for the Sierra Nevada from 1500 to 1900. You can then correlate this fire chronology to an independent drought reconstruction. So again, this has nothing to do with ring width. This is just the number of fires, the number of scars that occurred in each year. If you compare that to a drought record, you can see that Sierra Nevada fire was driven by drought. That's not that surprising. We kind of knew that already. We didn't have to take 2,000 samples and date 20,000 fire scars to know that fire in California was driven by drought. But I'll skip this part, unfortunately, because this now links the fire in California to jet stream reconstruction we did for the North Pacific. So looking at how the jet stream influences fire activity, but I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna have to skip this. But basically the conclusion of that research is that I mentioned that in the past, wildfire was influenced by how dry California was, and how dry California is related to the position of the jet stream over the North Pacific. What we see is that over the late 20th century, that relationship disintegrates. So nowadays, it doesn't really matter where your jet stream is, whether it's positioned right over California or somewhere else, there's always big fire danger. And the reason for that is that other component that I was talking about, not climate change, but the other component, which is fire suppression that's been happening. So this is the last I'll talk about, but I showed you this already. So these fire scars. Fires happened every 10 to 15 years in the Sierra Nevada, but then in the late 19th century, that stops all of a sudden. So you can see very frequent fire scars, but then this tree was sampled in 1998, but the last scar was in 1889. So in the beginning of the 20th century, in the Western US, the Forest Service was established with the mission of protecting the forests of the American West, which is all good and well. And they were very good at protecting these forests, but that involved putting out wildfires. So this is before we started doing this kind of tree ring research on wildfires, and early 20th century, they didn't know any better than that these wildfires were harming their forests. So they put out the fires, not knowing that actually these frequent ground fires were a natural and necessary part of the forest. And I'll show you an example of a very visual example of the results of, so we've been putting out these wildfires for more than a century now. And the result of that is, this is a photograph from a forest in Northern California taken in 1923, and that's what a forest looked like back then. So you have a number of big mature trees and then a little bit of underbrush. And so what happens in the past, prior to the 20th century, is that these frequent fires would burn off the underbrush, the ground fires, but they would largely leave the bigger trees alone. There would never be enough fuel for these fires to reach the crowns of the bigger trees. And then 10 years would pass, underbrush and grass would come back for 10 years, but then the next fire would happen and it would kill off that underbrush again. So there would never be enough buildup of fuel for fires to reach the crowns of the bigger trees. So you get a system of ground fires. Now what happens if you stop those ground fires from happening? So this is the same forest, 75 years later, 75 years of fuel suppression, you no longer get these two distinct layers. You get a forest where all of that underbrush has had the opportunity to grow for 75 years. And so you get a much denser forest with not two distinct layers, but now these intermediate layers that create like a ladder effect, so that now when a fire happens, there's way more fuel in the forest and you no longer get a ground fire, but you get a big destructive fire. And so that's what's happening at the same time as that climate change is happening. And that's what's resulting in a change in the fire regime across the American West, where we get destructive ground fires that are much harder to fight and much more dangerous. So in conclusion, tree rings can inform us, very general, about not only the past and the present, but also the future of not only the climate, but also how it influences ecosystems and human systems. So with that, I would like to thank all of my collaborators and my group members, and I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this really interesting talk, and also for giving us some insight into the nonlinear career pathways that can lead to this kind of really exciting research. So don't be scared that your path is not very linear or not so predictable, because I think this is this interdisciplinarity is really what's driving innovation, in fact, in climate sciences. So yeah. I will start reading the questions. So a first question by Heather Shoup is, what instrument was used to take the high resolution pictures of the cores?
They were scanned. So they were super, the trick is to sand them super finely. So that you can actually see all the individual cells, and they were scanned on a very high resolution. So you put them on a very high resolution scanner and scan them. For the details of that, I can send the link to the website, and I can refer to my colleague Dan Griffin's work. So the website or the website or the tool is called the Dendro Elevator, if you want to look into it.
Great. The next question by Yanis Tsiligakis. I'm wondering, over a period of 1,000 years, the solar activity, variability, and solar behavior, such as sunspots and CMEs, may play a role that shouldn't be overlooked.
Yeah, good question. You know, it's interesting because so the field of dendrochronology started in Arizona in really the early 20th century with one scientist, Douglas, who was originally an astronomer. And his whole idea to start looking at tree-rings was he was interested in solar variability, in solar cycles of the sun. Now we're more than 100 years later, and it's still not clear whether there is an influence of solar cycles on tree growth. Now there is on temperature, obviously, so you can see things like the Maunder minimum, the Dalton minimum in tree-ring-based temperature reconstructions. The individual 11-year cycle is much harder to track.
Sorry, I've lost track of my Q&A box. Yes. Second question of Yanis is, do you assume the angle of the Earth's precession is the same across the thousands of years your study covers? He does not think it's true and asks if you have calculated possible deviations due to the variation of that angle.
Yeah, so again, so the variation of the angle of the Earth honestly doesn't vary on year to year. It doesn't vary decade to decade. It varies on, millennial timescales. Mm-hmm. There's been a couple of studies that show, we know from other proxies, you don't need tree rings for that. You know that over the past 2,000 years, there's been a very slow cooling of the Earth that then has been reversed over the past 150 years. You can capture that very slow cooling using tree rings, especially using density. But one, you need very old trees to do that. You can't do it using 100-year-old trees. You're not going to find a 1,000-year-long trend. And two, I've not gone into a lot of detail about how we process our tree-ring data here, but there is obviously trees are living organisms. They include climatic information, but also a lot of non-climatic information. So dendrochronology, dendroclimatology is a very quantitative science that includes, our aim is to optimize the amount of climatic information tree rings can give us while minimizing the amount of non-climatic information. And so that is easier to do on decadal to centennial timescales than it is on millennial timescales. So it's hard to capture millennials, not impossible, but hard to capture a millennial scale climate variability. There's other proxies to do that, that are better suited to do that.
Yes, yes. Okay, another question by a name I unfortunately cannot read. The tree-ring cell with temperature correlations to study jet variability. Is this showing summer mean values and interannual summer variability? And can you get higher temporal resolutions?
Sorry, I'm going to read the question myself because there's a lot of components to it, I think. Is this showing summer mean values? I'm guessing you mean, oh, so I see. For the, so the, right, I get it. So for the density of the tree ring, it's not mean density, it's the maximum density in a year that we use. So the densest tree, the densest part of the ring, that's what we measure, and that how that varies from year to year. So we don't average it over the ring, we don't even average it over the tree ring, and this is not my research, this is based on 30 years of other people experimenting with various measures, but it turns out that the maximum late wood density is what is most sensitive to temperature. And indeed, you're right, measuring at different resolutions, the higher the resolution, obviously, the better the result, as with many things. But the higher the resolution, the longer it takes. I mean, not all techniques are able to measure at very high resolution, but there is a recent research that shows that if you measure the cell wall thickness at 10 or 20 microns, that's where you get the best results. But you need very specific equipment to do that.
And another question by Yanis Tsiligakis. He does not see error bars on your graphs. And he asks if you have graphs with error bars to share. But
Well, there are error bars on my graphs.
Actually. Yeah, there was a shaded area, I think, around the...
Not on the work in progress, because that's work in progress, but on our North Atlantic jet reconstruction, for instance, we did calculate uncertainty. So yeah, carefully.
Okay. A question by Kai Kornhuber. Is it possible that the changing signal in the jet index in recent decades is in part an expression of temperature anomalies becoming more extreme during high amplitude wave events, rather indicating a change in jet variability?
Good question. But so it's not the sensitivity of the tree rings to temperature that's changing. That is, we'll look into that. That is stable. It's not the dipole that is changing. What could be changing is indeed, so we're looking at summer temperature. Obviously, there's the effect of anthropogenic warming, so your heat waves are going to get hotter. But the cold extremes are not going to get colder. So you would that an increase in variance if it's heat waves, it's just going to be in one direction. It's not going to be in both directions. The other thing is it is indeed a tricky thing to do because the tree ring records that we use reflect temperature. They also reflect that increase in temperature trend that is independent of the dipole. So that's one of these things that we need to deal with, is how do we extract only or primarily that part of the variability that's reflected in the tree rings that we need to reconstruct the jet stream. So very good question. We are working on it.
Great. Just service announcement that we will stop accepting new questions now. So another question by Christian Zdanovic. He's asking, the example you showed for 1782 CE in Europe started from the tree-ring based anomaly. Has anyone performed the reverse analysis? For example, go through European historical records, identify years with well-documented widespread climate anomalies, droughts, heat waves, intense cold, etc., and then find out how many of those years anomalies have corresponding tree-ring anomalies that match in terms of both timing and polarity the reported climate anomalies. What would the success rate be? And would it be greater than expected by chance matching alone?
Yes, great question. I hope I show that tree-ring research is quite an involved and long research that takes a lot of time. Environmental history research is even much more, takes even much longer to do it properly. As I mentioned, this is work in progress, so we're obviously collaborating with environmental historians who know environmental and climatic history from documents in Europe well. For instance, there's Irish annals, monks who have been keeping track of weather conditions since 600. Extracting consistent climate information from those documentary records is really an art and a science per se, because obviously this has been recorded from 600 till now by very many different people who have very different views of what is worth reporting, what consists of what a cold summer consists of. So ideally, I fully agree, ideally that would be a great thing to do. In reality, it might be possible to do for the British Isles side of the things because there are such long, consistent records and environmental historians studying those records. I have to say for the Balkans, there is less environmental history research happening in that region. So it would be more spotty and less consistent.
Okay, great. Christian Müller asked a question. Introducing large mammals in the Sierra Nevada, could it solve the problem of lower vegetation?
It wouldn't solve the problem, but it would definitely help, and they're actually starting to do that. And it's interesting because if you look at the history, so great. They're starting to do that in certain in limited locations. We're talking grazing by sheep and goats primarily. And there's actually a historical precedent to that. So when you look at a fire history record, and I didn't show it because I ran out of time, but actually this is exactly what happened in the late 1800s. So before the Forest Service came in, after 1850, so in 1848, gold was discovered in California. The gold rush, loads of Europeans move in west. And to feed all those gold diggers, they brought loads of cattle with them and loads of sheep. There was other changes to forest management happening as well. They were cutting down trees to build the mines, to build the railroads and so forth. But a combination of logging and sheep grazing, you can actually see that in the fire record. So you're right. It could help alleviate the problem to bring in grazers again.
Interesting. Another question by Trond Iversen. A very interesting talk. Just a triviality, could you please repeat the conclusion slide?
Oh, sure, yeah. The very general conclusion slide.
I think the final conclusion slide.
Get to see all my collaborators again, and then here's so tree-ring's going to inform us about past, present, and future of climate, but also of ecosystems and human systems and how they are linked. And really, this is what I like about being a dendrochronologist. So we use one technique to study and the climate, and the history of climate, and the history of forest, and the history of humans, because there's this whole, I didn't talk at all about dendroarchaeology, but so tree-rings are also used to date buildings, musical instruments, and so forth. So it's really, our discipline is really at the nexus of these three really important fields, especially moving forward. The link between these three parts of the Earth system is going to be very important.
A question by Scott Robertson. Great stuff, Valerie. In addition to the locations in the Atlantic, the loading pattern for the AO or NAO also has a center of action in the Gulf of Alaska. Have you looked for correlations there?
Thanks, Scott. Thanks for that question. Not so much the Gulf of Alaska, but interestingly, and this is, I've not talked about it, but this is actually research that we're actively working on. My research group is working on at the moment, the American Great Lakes region. So there's a strong summer teleconnection, summer teleconnection between summer temperatures right where you're at, Scott, in Indiana, and then north from there, and the British Isles and the European side of things. That's really understudied, but I'm giving away my research ideas here. But that's part of research we're doing right now, is studying the teleconnection between the American European summer temperature teleconnection.
Another question by Heather Shoop. Thank you. Do you have forest management recommendations to reduce large, highly destructive fires?
Yeah, complex issue. So I think three things. One, prescribed burning. And controlled burns, and that can work on small areas. So recreate those ground fires for small patches where you're the one setting the fire, or the Forest Service is the one setting the fires when the weather is good, when the conditions are good, when they're not going to get out of hand. Ideally, the best method apparently is thinning first, so getting rid of that underbrush, piling it into piles, and then setting those piles onto fire. But that's extremely labor intensive. The other thing is, it might be time to let some forests burn, forests that are remote, that are not endangering people. That might, we might not have a choice. And the third one is, and I also didn't talk about this in this talk, but there is, I mentioned earlier the start of the Forest Service. I mentioned that when the Europeans came in after the gold rush, that changed the fire regime. Prior to that, in the 16th and the 17th and the 18th century, there was indigenous peoples living in California, in the Sierra Nevadas, throughout the American West, who lived sustainably with fires for centuries. They used fires, they managed their forests, making use of that fire, creating fires in small patches themselves. So the indigenous peoples have centuries of knowledge of how to live and sustain the forest system by making use of fire. So we urgently need to include the knowledge of indigenous peoples and include indigenous peoples themselves into our Forest Service, our forest management practices.
Okay, and I skipped the question by Stéphane Goyette, so I'll ask it now. Why wouldn't you link the tree rings behavior to the NAO evolution over the last decades instead of the jet stream path?
Good question, because we actually went the other way around. This, I think, boils down to what I was saying at the start of my talk, where we want to see what questions need answering and see whether we can answer them with our tree rings. And so if people have known my work, they know I've also reconstructed the NAO using tree rings. So this is where I started. That's the most straightforward thing to do. The NAO, the way I see it, is the surface expression of what's happening at the with the jet stream at higher elevations. So it's more straightforward if you use tree rings that grow, on the Earth's surface, to actually look at the NAO, but it's not quite as it doesn't answer some of the questions that need answering. And so I wanted to go one step beyond and see whether we could actually go further up in the atmosphere. And by doing that kind of jet stream work now for, a few years, I actually find it a much more elegant framework to look at climate variability than pressure fields by itself, or oscillations or patterns like the NAO. When we did the NAO reconstruction work, there's all these questions of, but the nodes move a bit in that direction. They do not only move in this direction, and you have to, when you're doing paleoclimate work, you use tree rings one data point per year to reflect atmospheric circulation over a certain area. You have to simplify, you have to find a way to simplify a part of the climate system so that you can condense it into one index that you can then reconstruct. NAO is one way of doing that. I find a jet stream, looking at the variability in the jet stream, a more comprehensive and elegant way of doing that.
A question by Christine Bingen. Thank you very much. Thank you for the very interesting talk. You said that the modern way to not or maintain forests is much more dangerous in terms of forest fires. What about aspects of biodiversity? And is there some trade-off to find in the way to maintain forests?
Well, I think the trade-off, the answer to that would be, as I mentioned earlier, including the knowledge of indigenous peoples in our forest management practices. Trade-offs, yeah, I mean, the thing is, biodiversity, the thing is, so the Forest Service was established 80 years ago, 100 years ago. We have been fighting forest fires for 100 years. We are now starting to do prescribed fires, but there's a lot of, people don't like it. The public does not like the prescribed fires because they want to preserve the forest, preserve the natural forest. And I'm putting this between quotations because in the American West, what people who were born like me in the 1970s think is natural forest, there's nothing natural about it. I mean, there's something natural about it, but it is a forest that has been impacted by 70, 80, 100 years of forest management. And so if you want to go back to the actual natural forest, you need to do more than you need to change the system of managing the forest the way we've been doing it. It's complex because obviously at the same time our climate has changed dramatically from 100 years ago. So you can't just go back one-on-one with how it was 100 years ago. You have to work with what's there now. I don't know if that's answering the question.
Okay, thanks. There's a question by Federico Grazzini. Is CO2 abundance affecting tree ring size?
CO2 abundance affecting tree ring
size?
Oh, another, when I'm talking about questions, big climate questions that we can potentially answer with our tree rings, that's a big one. Where the answer is out on that one. There's a lot of research happening. We're talking about the carbon fertilization effect, right? Do trees grow more now that there's more carbon in the atmosphere? The answer is some trees do, other trees don't, as you would expect. So there's a lot of research happening on that, amongst others using carbon isotopes, so C13, to look at water use efficiency. And so not really my field of expertise, but for what I understand, up to a certain level, obviously if trees have more carbon, they can grow more, but they only can grow more if they also have enough water and enough nutrients to, and it's not, and enough water, so it's not too dry to actually make use of that carbon. And so it's, and water is a big limiting factor to how much trees can grow more by picking up that carbon. but it's species dependent, it's region dependent. So it's a very active field of research, really good question. One that we need to start addressing as well.
Okay, so yeah, do you still have time to continue with the questions or?
I can continue, yeah, a little bit, yeah.
Okay, I will just take the remaining 4 that were asked before the cutoff. Tont Iversen asks a more scientific question. Are you able to separate between the contribution from summer heat and summer precipitation when characterizing the climate causing the growth of tree rings?
Yeah, a good question. We do that by, as I mentioned, so for instance, in so we do that, the first order of magnitude of doing that when measuring the width of the rings is by being selective of which trees you use. So for instance, trees here in Tucson in the American Southwest, useless for temperature reconstruction. All they care about the trees is how how wet or how dry it is. Same in Spain, in dry areas, the trees respond to how much water they have. So if we want to reconstruct drought, you go to dry regions. If you want to reconstruct temperature, you go to cold regions. You go to Scandinavia, Alaska, Siberia, and so forth. One way around it and how we were able to get temperature out of the Balkans is by measuring the density of the wood. So not the width of the wood, but the maximum late wood density. That turns out to be a much more reliable proxy for temperature specifically. It doesn't really care much. It doesn't really respond to precipitation. It's really a function of summer temperature.
Okay, and question by someone with the initial CHR. As far as I understand, there has been a calibration problem arising from increasing CO2, I guess, during the instrumental period. Has this been overcome?
Again, an active field of research. I think you're referring to the divergence issue, meaning that it's not clear whether it's caused by CO2, but meaning that trees are becoming, in those northern latitudes that I was talking about, Scandinavia, Siberia, we're seeing that they are becoming, as the climate is warming, that they are less sensitive to climate. So I mentioned that, to temperature. I mentioned that to reconstruct drought, we go to dry regions. To reconstruct temperature, we go to cold regions. But as those cold regions are warming, the trees are becoming less sensitive to temperature. So that's called the divergence issue. Or my colleague, Jan Esper, just got a big project to study that in depth to see what all the factors are going into that. But also that is with density, with measuring density, that divergence issue is much less extreme as it is with ring width.
Okay. And question by Beniamino Abis. When looking at tree rings from a given area, maybe some hundreds of kilometers, did you ever find groups of trees of the same species behaving significantly differently from each other under more or less the same climate conditions?
Whew, good question. A bit in that, and I'll explain why. As I mentioned, not all climate is not the only factor influencing tree growth, right? When we sample trees for climate reconstruction, we go to, cold or dry regions, but also we look for trees not in dense forest, for instance. In a dense forest, there's going to be a lot of competition between the trees, and that's going to really sometimes be a more important influence on the year-to-year variability than climate. So you might find a tree from a very dense forest and compare it to a lone standing tree and not find the same pattern. But that's why also when we do dendroclimatology, when we collect tree rings for climate reconstruction, we don't just collect trees from one tree. We don't collect trees from 5 trees. You want to have as much samples as you possibly can, so that and then you cross date them. I haven't talked about cross dating at all, but you match the patterns between the rings so that what they have in common, even if they might be, I mean, all individual trees are slightly different, but what they have in common is a climate that they grow under. So the more samples you combine into your reconstruction, into your chronology, the more you emphasize that commonality in the pattern, the more you get rid of that noise from individual trees.
Final question by Christine Bingen. How do you sample trees to minimize damage on the trees? How do you measure wood density? Only by measuring the cell size, or do you use some non-destructive or optical technique?
Yeah, nice questions. The first one, damage to the trees when sampling with a core, is very limited. You have to think about the damage is very limited. You have to think that of the stem of a tree, the only living part is a cambium, which is a very thin layer. It's only a couple of cells wide. That's in between the bark and the wood. Everything that's wood is dead. Everything that's bark is dead. So the vast majority of what we're sampling is dead material anyway. And so we're only taking, our cores are about 5 mil in diameter. We're only taking a part of about 5 mil in diameter from that living tissue of the tree, from that cambium. And it's really minimal. It's like drawing blood from a person. The second question about measuring density, very good question. Traditionally, it's being done through X-ray imagery. So you take an X-ray image of your sample, you look at it through, a densitometer, and then the value, the value of it's a proxy. You can, sorry, I'm not explaining it well. You can measure the gray value, and you can that you see on the X-ray image, and you can calibrate it against the actual wood density, and it's a proxy of wood density. It's a very time-consuming method, but for a long time it was the primary method to do it. Now there's and this is because of the value of maximum late wood density for climate reconstruction. There's a lot of methodological advances in developing new technologies to study this proxy. There's a few, one actually looking at the wood anatomy, so looking at actually measuring the cell wall width. That's a line of research that's ongoing. And to me, the most promising is actually a CT scanning, so 3D X-ray CT scanning. And there's only one machine that I know of. It's at the University of Ghent in Belgium. But there, it's non-destructive. You take your entire core, you put it in a scanner, zip, it's an X-ray scanner. It gives you, I'm exaggerating the simplicity of doing this, but it's really a very, very effective machine to non-destructively and at high resolution. I was talking about the importance of the resolution of your measurements. Density, but this is, we now have an active research proposal with the University of Ghent to develop this technique specifically for paleoclimate research. So it's work in progress to optimize techniques to study density. I like a lot these questions. I've had at least 3 or 4 questions where I had to say, like, this is work in progress, wait a bit, this is exactly what we're as a field working on. So they're really, really good questions.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for all the great questions, everyone. And thank you for answering them.